Some say time is relative, but if that's true, why do we measure it? Could it be that we want to be reminded of our own mortality? Does that clock represent our time on Earth? In Paravista, there lives a clock collector with a different opinion. To him, clocks represent his life.
I had a wife as a little kid. When I got a toy, I didn't play with it, I took it apart.
Now, his faith allows him to see the bigger picture of his own life experiences, which has led him to believe that God has influenced every pivotal moment in his story.
Certainly I could see God's hand and it all came together like a jigsaw puzzle, all these little pieces over the years.
Jürgen Lehmann was born in Berlin on the 10th of March 1940. Soon after, Jürgen's father was unwillingly conscripted to the German army, where he fought until the end of the war. Meanwhile, in 1943, because of the heavy bombing from the war, 3-year-old Jürgen, his siblings, and his mother were evacuated from Berlin to Czechoslovakia. Then, after the German surrender in May 1945, the Allies made the decision to violently expel all Germans from neighboring countries.
It was a very difficult time then for my mother.
Within the space of 5 years, between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union.
So they give us very short notice. They said, out, all the Germans have to leave now, and we only could take what we could carry, and we had to walk back to Berlin.
A pivotal moment occurred in Jürgen's life during this time, while they were resting at a railway station. His mother had no milk for his 9-month-old sister, but a concentration camp survivor, whom they'd never seen before, brought them milk and then disappeared.
It certainly was a miracle. First of all, that woman, she obviously had been in a concentration camp. And then she saw this German woman with her children in need, and she did something about it. I reckon it was an angel.
Once, or if the Germans reached the border, many expellees went to internment camps in Germany, which used to be Nazi concentration camps. Jürgen only survived because his father deserted the army and searched for them. This was the second pivotal moment Jürgen spoke of. His father heard a rumor that Germans were coming back from Czechoslovakia, so he went to the border. Here, columns of refugees marched towards Germany, but they were fighting the tide of refugees trying to sneak back to their homes.
The refugee strike really was stretching on for kilometers. And my mother just left the pram. I remember that she just dropped it and she ran across the tracks and embraced my father. I mean, what a coincidence. It was a miracle.
A third pivotal moment transpired when his family reached Berlin. Every house around theirs was destroyed, while only the windows of their apartment were blown out.
Just like an island house we lived in was a flat actually, was still standing.
In fact, 1/3 of Berlin, totaling 600,000 apartments, was wrecked and in piles of rubble, with less than half of the original population still living there. While living in Berlin, Jürgen's father, along with many other men, volunteered to rebuild the Berlin railways, which had been damaged by air raids. The Lehmann children attended school for the first time in 1947. However, the schools were badly damaged and therefore inoperable during the winter months. Jürgen attended school until he was 15, at which time he went to Frankfurt for a 3-year apprenticeship with the railways. Meanwhile, still during 1947, the first move of the newly elected Minister of Immigration for Australia, Arthur Calwell, was to establish the Populate or Perish initiative. In summary, he said that Australia needed to increase its population because the nation could not continue to defend itself with the current number of occupants. The plan was to employ immigrants in factories and other hard labor jobs, as well as the defense force. Calwell stated that the ideal annual population growth had to be 2% for this plan to work. Nevertheless, he still wanted to stick to the White Australia policy. So for the first few years, the invitation was extended to British migrants only, by introducing a cheap fare and assisted passage to Australia. Altogether, over 1 million British citizens migrated to Australia. Then, when there were insufficient migrant applications from Britain, the minister signed an agreement with the International Refugee Organization to receive migrants from Europe. At first, Australians weren't keen on the idea of European migrants, so Arthur Calwell brought over the beautiful Balts. They were 839 young men and women, approximately 23 years of age, from the countries around the Baltic. They were the propaganda of the migrant program, and they helped sell Arthur Calwell's idea and promoted the migration of others around Europe. In between 1947 and 1981, over 300,000 people migrated from countries in Europe other than Great Britain. In fact, data from 1971 shows that there was a peak of 110,820 Germans in Australia. But, still in 1958, the Lehman family joined the migration wave due to the lack of work available to the family. Most other people migrated because they had lost their homes as well. For German immigrants, the two available destinations were Canada or Australia. First, Jürgen and his brothers went to the Canadian embassy because that was their father's preference. Coincidentally, it wasn't open, so they had to get brochures from the open Australian embassy next door. Jürgen surmised that this was God's influence telling them to choose Australia.
There was always God looking after us. And
To make the journey, all immigrants had to sign a contract to work for the Australian government for 2 years before they could be a citizen.
we actually left Berlin on the 10th of March 1958, and I remember that because it's my birthday.
Initially, the train took them to Bremerhaven before they boarded the Norwegian migrant ship, the MS Scoubron. From Bremerhaven, on March 14th, they headed across the Mediterranean towards Aden in Saudi Arabia. Jürgen remembers the good quality service aboard the ship, including the many meals, which was a big change to those from Berlin who'd experienced food shortages for the past few years.
The trip was very interesting because we went around Spain and Gibraltar to the Mediterranean.
Early on March 31st, after the ship passed through the Red Sea, the crew ran a routine fire drill. A few hours later, tragedy struck when a fire started in the engine room.
And first when the fire alarm went, they said, oh, we had a fire drill this morning. It's not a fake, it's a 1st of April joke.
Jürgen made it off the ship on the second-to-last lifeboat at around 10:30 p.m. Thankfully, the 208-member crew and all but one of the 1,288 passengers survived, with the exception dying from an unrelated heart attack. Jürgen believes that God influenced the crew to run the fire drill because there was minimal panic and no casualties. Compared with the tragedies of other sinking boats, such as the 134 casualty wreck of the SS Morro Castle during the same time period, this was a rarity. The Lehmans were split up during the evacuation and, along with every other passenger, lost all of their luggage.
I had nothing else, only what I had in my pockets.
First, they were rescued by a small ship, the City of Sydney, then transferred to the larger SS Roma for the journey back to Aden. The pregnant women and young children were flown from Aden to Darwin, while everyone else was picked up by the Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, a Dutch passenger liner, which completed their passage to Fremantle. The Johan van Oldenbarnevelt carried Jürgen to Australia, arriving in Fremantle on the 5th of May, when they set foot on Australian soil for the first time.
And of course we were full of amazement about Australia. The cars all drove on the wrong side of the road. And
2 days later, the Johan van Oldenbarnevelt left Perth for Melbourne, where the Lehmans finally stepped off the ocean for good. The next stage of their journey was a train ride to Bonegilla Migrant Training and Reception Centre. Migrant reception camps were established all over Australia, but the Bonegilla Migrant Camp and Training Centre in Victoria was the longest and largest operating migrant camp in the post-war era. The directors of these camps made sure each migrant was taught English, but also about the values of Australian culture, ready for their eventual citizenship. Family fortunes were not dependent on overseas qualifications, so Jürgen's father, who was a master baker in Germany, was very unhappy with the types of odd jobs he had to do to provide for his family.
At one time he was picking weeds in the graveyard. Another time he was working for the railways with a pickaxe.
Once a full-time job finally opened up, the immigration department sent them to Sydney. Gradually, the whole family found sufficient work and bought a house in Chester Hill.
My mother started then to get pretty homesick. My parents found it very difficult, the language.
In November of 1961, Jürgen's family decided to move back to Berlin. This was 3 months after the Berlin Wall had been constructed.
I was horrified in Berlin when I saw that wall. I was devastated.
He wrote back to his family begging them not to come. They didn't listen.
But unknown to my parents, before I went to Germany, I already had a return migrant visa in my passport.
He inherited the house and built a life in Chester Hill, where he also joined the Gnadenfrei German Lutheran Church. Jürgen found a meaningful connection within the church community in Australia. Fortuitously, this was also where he met his first wife, Raylene, who was working at the church at the time. In 1968, Jürgen married Raylene and they moved to South Australia, where her family was. They were married for many years, had 2 children, and a nice house in Para Vista. Sadly, Raylene passed away in 2016. Jürgen experienced half a year of deep depression until he heard God's voice.
Oh, very, very clearly, God speaking to me and saying, look, Jürgen, it's not about you.
And thus, Jürgen's faith helped him out of his despair.
My faith is my most important thing from now on, number 1.
For the first time, he joined a dating website. After a year of searching, he had just about given up when one last woman, Marianne, emailed him. According to Jürgen, this was divine intervention. They met for the first time at Tea Tree Plaza and eventually got married in 2018. He was 78 years old.
That we live here for a purpose, and the purpose is not for ourselves.
Because his own clock has plenty of time left, Jürgen hopes that he can still influence other people's lives with his own life experiences.